The camera stopped rolling, and 20 crew members watched as River Phoenix and Johnny Depp were told that method acting is dangerous on the set of My Own Private Idaho. Portland, Oregon, September 1991. The abandoned warehouse serves as base camp for Gus Van Sant's ambitious independent film exploring street hustlers, fractured families, and the psychological damage that drives young men toward self-destructive survival strategies. This isn't a mainstream Hollywood production with extensive support systems and protocol safeguards. It's an intimate character study that demands emotional authenticity from actors willing to access psychological territories most performers carefully avoid. The set reflects the film's raw aesthetic, minimal lighting equipment, handheld cameras that capture spontaneous moments, practical locations that blur the line between performance and reality. The air carries the particular tension that emerges when artistic ambition pushes beyond conventional filmmaking boundaries toward dangerous psychological territory where fictional trauma intersects with personal experience. River Phoenix, 21 years old, sits exhausted against a concrete wall, still wearing the worn clothes of Mike Waters, the narcoleptic street hustler whose childhood trauma and desperate search for maternal love mirrors River's own complex relationship with abandonment and identity formation. The role requires accessing emotional depths that leave lasting psychological residue long after cameras stop recording daily scenes. Beside him, Johnny Depp processes his own emotional exhaustion from inhabiting Scott Favor, the wealthy young man who embraces street life to rebel against privileged expectations, while ultimately returning to the security his background provides. At 28, Johnny recognizes the dangerous psychological territory they're exploring through characters whose pain feels uncomfortably authentic and personally relevant. This role is changing something fundamental inside me, River confesses quietly, his voice carrying the particular weariness that comes from sustained emotional excavation without adequate recovery time. Mike's abandonment issues, his desperate need for love and acceptance, it's activating parts of my own psychology that maybe should stay buried and unexamined. I feel it too, Johnny agrees, understanding the parallel between method acting's psychological demands and their characters' self-destructive patterns. Scott's rebellion against his father, his attraction to dangerous situations, it's bringing up my own unresolved relationship with authority figures and compulsive risk-taking behaviors. Their morning begins with intensive scene preparation that requires both actors to access traumatic emotional states without adequate psychological protection or professional therapeutic support. Van Sant's directorial approach emphasizes authentic emotional expression over performer safety, pushing performances toward dangerous psychological territory that prioritizes artistic results over performer well-being. This confrontation scene demands everything from you both, Van Sant explains, preparing them for an intense exchange between Mike and Scott that explores abandonment, sexuality, and the desperate need for human connection that drives people toward relationships that ultimately cause more pain than healing. River and Johnny spend hours preparing through emotional recall techniques that deliberately blur boundaries between personal trauma and character psychology, accessing memories and feelings that most people spend years in therapy learning to process safely with professional guidance. The filming process intensifies as both actors lose themselves completely in characters whose psychological damage mirrors their own unresolved issues, creating dangerous feedback loops where fictional trauma activates real psychological wounds that haven't healed properly through adequate therapeutic intervention. Van Sant encourages this deep psychological immersion, believing that authentic emotional pain translates into more compelling screen performances that resonate with audiences seeking genuine human experience rather than superficial entertainment designed to avoid uncomfortable psychological truths. Several crew members express private concern about the actor's emotional state during breaks between scenes, noting behavioral changes and signs of psychological distress that suggest the performance demands are exceeding healthy boundaries between professional obligation and personal psychological safety. That's when Dr. Sarah Martinez enters the set. Martinez represents growing concern within independent filmmaking communities about method acting techniques that prioritize artistic authenticity over performer well-being. Her extensive background in psychology and film production consultation provides expertise in recognizing when artistic dedication crosses the line into psychological endangerment that threatens long-term mental health stability that affects their ability to function outside their professional obligations. Gus, Martinez calls out, her voice carrying authority earned through years of witnessing talented performers destroyed by roles that demanded more psychological sacrifice than human beings can safely provide without permanent damage to their emotional and mental well-being. Van Sant and crew members recognize potential conflict between artistic vision and performer safety, understanding that Martinez's presence suggests serious concerns about methods being employed to achieve desired emotional authenticity at potentially devastating personal cost to the actors involved. Martinez studies both exhausted actors with trained clinical attention, her experienced eye recognizing symptoms of psychological depletion that occur when method acting techniques access traumatic material without adequate therapeutic support, recovery protocols, or professional boundaries that protect performer mental health. River, Johnny, Martinez says with professional directness that cuts through typical set hierarchy and artistic ego protection. I've been observing your preparation and performance processes over the past several days. What you're doing isn't psychologically sustainable without serious long-term consequences to your mental health and personal relationships. 8 seconds pass as Martinez's clinical assessment settles over the set like a dark cloud, cast and crew recognizing potential confrontation between artistic ambition and mental health considerations that most independent productions prefer to avoid addressing directly due to budget constraints and creative pressure. The silence stretches as everyone processes the implications of professional psychological intervention in their artistic process, understanding that Martinez's concerns suggest their methods may be causing genuine harm rather than simply pushing creative boundaries. Method acting is dangerous, Martinez continues, with devastating precision earned through treating performers whose careers and personal lives were systematically destroyed by roles that required accessing psychological territory beyond their emotional capacity to process safely without permanent psychological damage. The words land like physical blows, forcing recognition of risks both actors have been systematically ignoring while pursuing artistic authenticity that may ultimately cost more than any performance is worth, regardless of critical acclaim, career advancement, or industry recognition that might result from their psychological sacrifice. Van Sant feels immediate tension between his artistic vision and moral responsibility for performer safety, understanding that creating great art shouldn't require destroying the people who create it, but also recognizing that sanitized performances might lack the emotional truth his film demands from its exploration of damaged characters. Then River Phoenix does something that surprises everyone on set, including Martinez herself. Instead of defending his method or dismissing her concerns as outside interference with artistic process, he looks up at her with genuine curiosity rather than defensive resistance or wounded artistic pride. Dr. Martinez, River says quietly, his voice carrying exhaustion that inadvertently proves her point about psychologically unsustainable methods,
Can you explain specifically what you're seeing that concerns you? I want to understand the psychological risks I might be creating for myself without realizing the long-term consequences. Martinez's expression shows genuine appreciation for his intellectual openness and willingness to prioritize psychological safety over artistic ego, a rare quality among method actors whose professional identity becomes dangerously invested in psychologically harmful practices they mistake for artistic dedication. River continues with growing honesty despite obvious vulnerability. This character is systematically bringing up childhood trauma I thought I'd adequately processed through previous therapy. The line between Mike's abandonment pain and my own experiences is completely disappearing, and I honestly don't know how to maintain healthy psychological boundaries. Johnny immediately supports his friend while addressing Martinez directly with equal concern. We both came into this role genuinely wanting authentic performances that serve the story and honor these characters, but if the cost is permanent long-term psychological damage, we definitely need to find safer approaches that still serve the artistic vision. The silence that follows carries completely different energy than typical film set discussions, not artistic debate about creative choices, but recognition that these young men are actively prioritizing mental health over career advancement and critical recognition that might result from their psychological sacrifice. Van Sant, observing this exchange, recognizes authentic concern rather than typical performance anxiety or artistic temperament issues that occasionally emerge during demanding film production schedules. What would psychologically safer method acting look like practically? Van Sant asks Martinez directly. How can we achieve the emotional authenticity this story requires without creating psychological endangerment for our performers? Martinez explains alternative approaches in detail, compartmentalization techniques that deliberately separate actor psychology from character trauma, structured post-scene processing that prevents fictional experiences from contaminating personal emotional states, ongoing therapeutic support that helps performers access difficult material without lasting psychological residue that affects their personal lives. The goal isn't to eliminate all emotional risk from performance, Martinez clarifies carefully, but to ensure that artistic choices don't create permanent psychological damage that affects your lives, relationships, and mental health long after filming ends and everyone moves on to other projects.
Over the following weeks, both actors work closely with Martinez to develop healthier approaches to accessing difficult emotional material, learning sophisticated techniques that preserve performance authenticity while protecting mental health and personal relationships from the psychological demands of their roles. The film ultimately benefits from their continued emotional commitment, while both actors successfully maintain psychological boundaries that prevent character trauma from becoming personal psychological damage that extends beyond their professional obligations to the artistic project. Years later, both actors speak about the My Own Private Idaho experience as profoundly educational regarding the complex relationship between artistic dedication and personal safety, understanding that truly great performances shouldn't require destroying the performers who create them through psychological sacrifice. Martinez occasionally references their case in professional presentations about film industry mental health practices, emphasizing how their willingness to acknowledge psychological vulnerability enabled more sustainable artistic practices than actors who systematically ignore safety concerns until psychological damage becomes irreversible. 8 seconds on a film set in 1991. One crucial moment when two young actors chose psychological safety over artistic martyrdom, learning and growth over self-destruction. One choice that enabled continued careers and personal well-being rather than the tragic trajectory that systematically destroys talented performers who mistake psychological endangerment for authentic artistic commitment. The day that definitively proved authentic artistic expression requires actively protecting the person creating the art, because psychologically destroyed performers cannot continue creating the meaningful work audiences desperately need from their unique talents and irreplaceable perspectives.